some people who are vegetarians, like, they will eat chicken. Have you noticed that? See that? Like, chicken is just real darn close. It's like kind of a cusp species there or something. It's kind of like broccoli walking around with a couple of carrots with a tomato on top of it. It's in between. Well, we knew supper was going to be fried chicken, and we just stood there not knowing what to do. And Grandma was a wise woman. That's where the wisdom we have in this world, I swear, that's where it comes from. It's from the grandmothers, handed down. She was wise. She just stood there with that back door open, and this cloud of aroma would come out of the back door. We could see it when we were kids. I don't suppose we'd be able to now, but back then we could see it, this cloud of aroma of fried chicken and chicken gravy and fresh homemade bread and corn and beans, maybe some peach pie. It would come directly for us. It did not disperse in the evening air. We could see it. We stood there transfixed. She stood there with a little smile on her face, watching the cloud come towards us. And the first boy hit would get this goofy look on his face, and he'd say, I'm going in now. I don't know, I don't feel like staying on anymore. I'm going in. I'll see you guys later. He would turn and break from the pack, which was a brave act, and go running up the hill. That would do it. That would dispel the bonds of our little tribe. We'd all be right on his heels. We'd go running in through the back door, and chicken and milk and boys and dogs and bread and everything would just go flying. When I go down to see Grandma, I gain a lot of weight with her dear hands. It's plate after plate she cans the pickled sweet and dill, and the songs of the whippoorwill in the morning dew and the evening moon. I really gotta go see her soon, 'cause the canned goods I buy at the store ain't got the summer in them anymore. And you bet Grandma, as sure as you're born, I'll take some more potatoes and a thunderstorm. Peaches on the shelf, potatoes in the bed. Supper ready, everybody, come on in and taste a little of the summer. Taste a little of the summer. Taste a little of the summer. My grandma put it all in jar. What a woman.
Fare you well, my honey. Fare you well, my only true one. All the birds that were singing are flown, except you alone. Going to leave this broke-down palace on my hands and my knees. I will roll, roll, roll. Make myself a bed by the waterside. In my time, I will roll, roll, roll. Mine's in the living room and eggshells on the floor. I lost myself in the shadow of your honor and your pain. You stare out of the window as our dreams go down the drain. Invisible. The war after the war. I get no basic training. I get no Purple Heart. I'm supposed
supposed to be. I'm stuck. Does it get easier?
Welcome to the treasure room.
Truly the outrage that I would dare to say that the webcam is not good. The outrage, which you have said, and you know what? We should begin here.
We should start with it.
I want to apologize to you. I've felt very badly about a couple of things. The first thing is I said I looked better on air than you, which is true, but I'm sorry I said it.
It should go unsaid.
It shouldn't have been said out loud. So I'm sorry for that. Second of all, I stole your word, and I honestly, in my head, I wanted to say, can I say craptastic on air? And then they answer me, say, well, okay, anyway, that's John's word. He used it in his review, but he's right. But I got derailed, and I didn't give you credit. So your word is craptastic. Well, it's fantastic. Your word is fantastic, but the word craptastic is a word you used to describe the webcams in your review, and I said it on live national TV, and I passed it off as my own, and that was wrong.
All right.
So I'm very sorry.
I've spent the last 48 hours on a deep dive on this very issue. The webcam quality aside, all I've done is look into this language. It turns out you didn't quite steal my word. You did say craptastic. You did try to steal my word. But my word from my review was craptacular.
Oh. I would like to take back the last 5 minutes of this recording.
This is how deep down the rabbit hole we are.
I am so sorry. I'm sorry to all the listeners. I was wrong. I did not mean to apologize actually for anything.
Anyway, craptacular, craptastic, however you want to talk about it. And so I'm enjoying, you do TV more than me, and you do video weekly with the Wall Street Journal. I've started doing these CNBC hits, and I enjoy it, even though it stresses me to no end. But I basically have agreed to start doing it, and they've been very politely asking me for years, because I'm home and the timing works out. Like a lot of times over the years, they've asked me like, oh, there's a big Apple event and it's in California. Can you do a hit on CNBC? And then it's like, it would require you to be somewhere in downtown San Francisco at 5:30 in the morning, Pacific time. And it's like, no, sorry.
Yep. I know the ask very well. Right. I know the ask very well.
Not going to happen.
It's like, I'm going to be inside the event at that moment, right, covering it. How will I be on your television show too?
Right. Or I'm not going to get up, at 4 a.m. and go do it. It's not worth it. But when I can do it from home and I don't have to go anywhere, it's good. And the CNBC hosts are very knowledgeable for people who are talking about all sorts of business, anything that pops up all during the day. The hosts on Squawk Alley, like John Fort, all the questions are great. John Fort pulled out
the best.
He pulled out is this the biggest thing for the Mac since the Next acquisition? I don't think that's an exaggeration. I think that's actually a good analogy. But how many people on TV business news could pull that out?
They're the best. I mean, that show in particular, but I'm on a lot of CNBC shows, and it's always, one thing I've done a lot of TV in my time, and they always want to get you to say something, right? Like, so you could say it and it'd be some controversial thing, and that's a good soundbite. I never feel that way with all the CNBC shows that I'm on. And especially Squawk Alley with Carl, John, and depends on who else the other anchor is. I was stepping in, but this week it was Julia. Yeah. And they're all wonderful, and they really know their stuff.
Yeah, and they're I can tell, and exactly that. Like, and you think faster than I do. You're meant for video. I think slow, and I get caught up, and I'm like, I've been trapped, and I can't figure my way out of the trap. And next thing I know, the hit's over, and my time is gone. I don't want to get trapped into that, like, hey, we're trying to get you to say something, a news bite. I always get the sense with them that they really just want to get to the kernel of truth. What's the deal with these MacBooks? What's the deal with the new iPhone? And I really appreciate that, so I keep doing it. But the other thing is, it does go fast, right? It's
so like, fast.
You're on. They do a great job of getting you ready to go. But it is so much more convenient doing this remotely, but it's also sort of like doing it blind, right? Like, you're just there, and there's a little voice from a control room person who's very professional and very nice, and they seem very keenly aware of how in the dark you are, but it's like, they cut to a commercial. They're like, okay, you're on after the commercial, but then you see nothing. It's like, you don't get to watch the commercials or anything. And you're just like, okay. And then,
I've gotten pretty used to it. I've been, I was doing these pretty frequently actually before COVID. And then after COVID, I've definitely, there was a bunch of time where they were definitely not interested in tech news, understandably. So I wasn't called a lot, but over the last couple of months doing a lot of these, and actually I'm a contributor. So I probably should watch what I say about CNBC, though I everything I say here is like, I'm being completely honest. But one thing I look like such an idiot. I'm just sitting in front of my computer smiling for like usually 3 minutes before these things start, which I think is just like hilarious. Just like, nobody else is around, but I don't know when it's like going to really start. So I just sit here like smiling like a true asshole, just like, oh, you going to talk to me yet? Are they on me? Like my dog is probably like, what the fuck is she doing?
Right. You sit there in your office chair where you usually have no self-awareness at all. And I'm just slumped with the worst possible posture. Meanwhile, I'm sitting there like I'm on stage ready to get called up to get like an award or something, ramrod straight back, square shoulders, looking straight ahead. And it's like, and then this time I got panicked too. And it's like, usually, I'll feel free to like dick around on my phone, right? I don't want to mess with my computer, but I'll sit there and like, well, I've got a couple minutes here. And then all of a sudden I remembered that with all the latest software updates, there's the magic switching of AirPods Pro, which I was using for my audio and my input. And I was like, wait, I don't want to mess this up with my phone and have the AirPods switch over to the phone and then they're not on the Mac. And it's like, I don't think that would work. I think it's supposed to be smart, but it's like, you don't want to mess with it when you're supposed to go on TV. So I was like, and I'm like, oh, I should have had like a magazine here. I have nothing.
No, you're like basically in a virtual green room, except like the camera's pointing at you always. But yeah, the flying blind thing is tough because when you used to be on set with an anchor and some other guests, what I always really liked is they would book me with another guest. So we would kind of maybe even, tussle a little. They even said in our thing, like, I've never seen two guests agree so much.
I know.
They definitely like to have some, difference of opinion. And in fact, there's like one great one where I just told the guy he's flat out wrong. And I was like, I bet him. I was like, you're totally wrong. Apple is not going to announce that. But here I can't see you. I can't see them. And I even felt like, oh, I would, mention John, but is John on camera with me right now? Are we are we a split screen? Is it just me? Is it just him? So that is, and you can't see the anchors. I haven't actually seen the anchors face to face since like, I don't know, February.
Yeah, I did. I saw John when we were, I don't know how it worked. I don't know what they were, but like 2 weeks ago when I was talking about the phones, I didn't see anybody. And this time I did see John, but I didn't see you. It was all crazy.
I think you get the feed sometimes of like whatever's in the studio. Yeah. Sometimes I see Carl, I guess. And when I do the morning show, I've seen Mike, I believe. Yeah. Anyway,
the thing that we had hard time, we just didn't have enough time to get out, is that it made it seem as though you and I were arguing over the camera, where you said the camera is craptastic, trying to steal my word, but coming up with your own made up crapular word. And then I interjected with, well, I'm using it right now. And I was. And I had no idea if it looked good or not. I wasn't trying to like refute you, but I realized in hindsight, it came across as me saying, well, I'm using it and it looks great. I didn't know what it looked like. I tested it side by side. I knew it looked better than the old ones. But it made it seem like we disagree. Like you say these cameras stink and I'm saying I love them. I think it's so great. I used it to go on TV. Whereas I think the truth is we actually even further, here's the one point where it seemed like maybe we had like a little point of, hey, this is fun, on TV. But we actually, I think, completely agree, which is that the camera still stinks overall, but it is way better than the MacBook cameras before.
Yes. We definitely agree on all of that. I wouldn't say way better.
Maybe we can mildly hash out how much better, way better.
Right. Because in my video, not the CNBC video, but the Wall Street Journal review video that I did have a short place where I actually used the webcam quite a bit. And I had a short place where I showed both side by side. I think that you could really see in that frame. I mean, lighting was good, so it was a good place to see. both looked fine, but the difference between I was definitely using the 2020 Intel MacBook Air on one side and the 2020 M1 MacBook Air. And it's a little bit brighter. You definitely can see there's like less compression, and you can also see that there's just like better lighting or more even lighting, which are all the things that Apple said was going to be improved here using machine learning and no actual upgrade to the hardware. But it's still just not as good as a dedicated webcam,
right,
one you'd buy from Logitech, one you use on your iPhone,
right,
one that in the case of CNBC would happen. I want to explain here. I decided a couple of weeks ago I needed to up my CNBC game. I was using my iPhone using Camo, this software.
CAMO. Right.
CAMO. I was using that on the Mac and on the iPhone, and it was working great. I liked it a lot, but it wasn't like looking as good, frankly, as Nilay Patel, who also is a CNBC contributor, and sometimes we're on together, and I'm like, I can't have Nilay look better than me. Like, that's not okay. And so I decided I'm going to do what he was doing, which is hooking up my Sony camera, my Sony RX100 to my computer. I got a HDMI connector. I did all the things. And so I was like really excited because this is my first time using that on air. And it's like night and day better than a webcam in the MacBook.
Right.
So what I think happened, or I know what happened, is first of all, in the Zoom window where I connect with CNBC, I looked very good. I was very crisp. You could see the full view of my window or of my background. And then CNBC crops into that pretty significantly. Then CNBC is running that through Zoom through their own software or some sort of, what's it called? Forget the technical name that they use in TV, switcher or something. And so that's further compressing it. Plus, I was dumb and I didn't get the Ethernet dongle. Actually, it wasn't dumb, honestly. The 13-inch MacBook Pro only has 2 USB ports, which is infuriating to me because I've been coming from the 16-inch where I had all the things hooked up, and I decided not to use Ethernet. So I was on my not that great Wi-Fi, and all of those things compounded to make my video not look great.
Interesting.
Versus you, who are just actually having a very simple webcam, using the simple webcam, which looked fine, but like definitely did not look as good as the image that was really coming out of my system.
Yeah. I feel like side by side, it's a very interesting example of proving that the M1 chip and using Apple Silicon and having this pipeline where the camera feeds directly into the M1, and it even helps with security, where the M1 can electronically gate whether software has access to the camera and make sure the green light goes on. But it goes through I guess I think they do say there's machine learning involved too, but I know there's an image signal processing chip that before the computer, the Mac software ever even sees the image, the image signaling processor chip already has cleaned up the image in a way that on the Intel MacBooks to date, that doesn't happen. And it's a great example of, okay, here's this real crappy 720p camera. Here's what it looks like on Intel. And it's not like Apple spent years purposefully making it look worse because they knew the M1 was coming. It's like, I'm sure they were trying. But now with this image signaling processor, you get this better image. And it's definitely less noisy. It's same camera, but it's a lot less noisy. They're definitely white balance improvements. And you see that more at nighttime. Like, so one of the cheats I had for the CNBC thing is doing it at 11 a.m. Eastern time. I get really nice natural light in my office, and that helps a lot. When I was doing tests for my review, I shot a lot of it at night. And my office has fine office lighting, but it's, incandescent office lighting. And it's just amazing how blue you look. It shouldn't be. It should be, if anything, it should be warm. It just totally throws it off. The noise is off the charts. But then there's, you don't have to be like a super picky professional to start noticing, hey, they're cheating here. Like they're doing like the Barbara Walters filter where they're like looking for faces and then they just sort of electronically smear gauze all over it, It's like, so my face, your face on this camera doesn't look as noisy as it did on the Intel MacBooks, which is terrible, and the color temperature is way better. But as soon as you look for that gauzy, well, they're just sort of blurring your face, and it's like, oh yeah, I see that. That's a cheat, and it doesn't look good. It's not. I mean, it looks better than before, but you can start seeing how they're cheating.
Yeah, and you also, I think they're using the same technique. One of the big things that I noticed on the 16-inch MacBook Pro is the like reaction to light sources. Do you ever notice that it's just like completely blown out?
Yeah, yes, totally. Yeah.
And that is also much better here. So if I have like a big light behind me, not like a big window, but even just a lamp in back of me, that is less blown out.
Yeah.
No, it's that they made improvements. They certainly made improvements, but it's going to get better. Yeah. It can get so much better. And again, this is something I just keep thinking. They know it. They've put a 1080p camera on the iMac. They're also using some software to improve that. That's where it's headed. That's what we should have on these brand new systems. But I'm not going to complain too much about it because these brand new systems are truly amazing.
I feel like what they've, and I think it makes in hindsight, it makes a lot of sense, but they honestly changed nothing that they didn't have to change. I mean, it is externally, and I had one side by side. There is no physical difference. I only had the MacBook Pro, by the way. It sounds like from your review, you had the Air, like the 999 Air, right?
I had the, it's 12, I forget the exact number, 1250. Let me look it up. I had slightly better than the 999 because it has the 8-core CPU. Oh,
the GPU, you mean? Yeah.
Yeah, sorry, the 8-core GPU, but still had 8 gigabytes of RAM.
Right.
So it's a little bit of an odd config, but it's like the second bump up on their site.
But like physically, compared side by side with the Intel versions that are the latest and greatest, you really have to turn them on to see that there's anything unless you happen to know the model number, and the model number is literally printed in the smallest type on the bottom plate that you could possibly read. And you just have to know that like A2338 is, that's an M1 MacBook. Otherwise, the hardware is like the same. It's the same trackpad, the same keyboard, the same touch bar, the same buttons, the same screens, where the Pro has this 500 nit Mac screen and the Air is 400 nit. The same bezels that, by today's laptop standards are maybe slightly.
In this episode of Software Sessions, I'm talking to Pete Snyder about the many ways websites track us, how ad blockers like uBlock Origin work, and the process of developing web standards with privacy in mind. We start by discussing his role as a senior privacy researcher at Brave Software.
Brave is kind of interesting or unique as a startup in that we have a proper research lab. I think our research team is 7 or 8 people right now. And so those are people who do research in the form of published publications, but also doing research that ties back into products some way. So my research responsibilities are to figure out new ways that you can improve browser privacy, address tracking on the web, and solve the kinds of problems that Brave is interested in solving. I have 1 foot in engineering world and 1 foot in publishing world.
Why is academic research important in this space?
My gut feeling is that what's useful about academic research is that it changes the incentives and it gives you a chance to do things that are more novel and particularly things that are less tied to a short-term ROI kind of cycle. And so that is particularly useful for things that have like watchdog functions over industry, things that are more difficult to monetize, but more useful to maybe average web users. That's not to say there aren't people who try to build businesses around privacy or responsible computing, but the incentives don't always work that way. So what's really neat about doing a research-focused computing career, you can do things that don't have to, make somebody money on the short term. You can pick more oddball projects, things that might not come to fruition right away.
And is there a key difference in how you approach a problem when you're doing it in an academic context versus as a product for a company?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, so they go both ways. So if I'm working for something at Brave, the emphasis is on correctness and certainty and knowing that when we ship it to 10 million people or whatever, that it's not going to break and it's going to do what what it says in the tin, and that it's going to be like a material improvement over the state of things before we ship that feature. And that's really different than if you're trying to come up with a research project where sometimes good, sometimes bad, but the emphasis is not necessarily on 100% correctness, but is on novelty, and doing something or figuring out some way to solve a problem in a way that hasn't been tackled before. And so you'll read research papers that say it works 95% of the time, and that'll be, sufficient or compelling for a research paper, but you wouldn't want to ship something that breaks, on like 1 out of 20 websites if you're actually making a product. And so the goals are different, but also like the success criteria are different.
So it sounds like you can tackle things where it wouldn't be good enough for a product yet, but it's something that if you were working on it within the context of a company, they might say like, oh, we're not going to do that because it just doesn't seem like it's going to work. Yeah,
exactly. So maybe because it's not going to, like, certainty of success isn't there, or there isn't a 1 or 2 step obvious path to being a product. Maybe it conflicts with a current business goal or whatever else. But yeah, there's a much more latitude in terms of projects you can choose and kind of problems you want to tackle if you're writing research papers. And likewise, like, not that I'm some incredible researcher or anything, but if you're trying to do successful research, like, it doesn't reward you to like solve that final like 5% of the problem. There's no benefit to getting, no, not none, but there's a small benefit of going from 95% to 99% like success or accuracy. Well, on product, like, you have to grind out as close to 100 as you can get.
And do you have examples of things where you worked on it in a research context and it actually became a part of a product?
Sure, yeah. So a couple things. One is that, so there's a research paper that we wrote at Brave called SpeedReader. SpeedReader is a different way of doing like a reader mode in a browser. Right now, if you use any of the reader modes in popular browsers, you download the page, you render some subset of it, you throw some JavaScript at it, and it extracts sections that it thinks are useful, and then it presents a new page to you. That's not 100% correct. Chrome's DOM distiller does something slightly different, but to approximation, you render the page, and then you extract stuff out of it. Brave's SpeedReader does something different. It intercepts it at a network layer. It examines the text HTML, does the analysis there, and then feeds that back to the rendering engine. And so there's a bunch of nice benefits there. There's a privacy improvement in that you're executing less code, talking to less third parties. There's a performance improvement as well, in that you don't have to do the initial displaying and tear all that stuff down and build it back up. So that was a research paper that we published at WWW 2018, 2019, I don't remember, but either a year or 2 ago. And it's now in beta in Brave. So that's maybe the oldest one. And the most recent one also was a project that I did last summer with a student from North Carolina, Quan Chen, on figuring out ways that we can do blocking better. So right now, if you're using a privacy tool in a browser, in most cases, you're downloading a big list of things that should get blocked. They look kind of like regular expressions. It says, yes, block this. No, don't block that. And it's a useful thing, but it has the trade-off of, it's very easy to circumvent that. Somebody can just change the URL, move it to a different domain, inline it in the page, whatever else. And so the approach that we took in this paper is, let's not focus on the URL. Let's build signatures of the execution paths of these scripts, and we can use that as like the oracle to identify this is known bad or known good. And well, that machinery ended up being very complicated, and it ended up, it isn't something we want to ship to all our users because of the performance hit. It's something that we use for generating filter lists that we ship down to users regularly.
Existing projects, you were saying, are just looking at a list of URLs, and you said using something like regular expressions to figure out if the URL it's pulling is on that list. The part I wasn't clear about is the sort of new way that you were describing worked.
Yeah, so the alternative approach that we came up with is to instead not care about like where the code came from or even how the code is structured, so if it's obfuscated in some way, but instead to look at the DOM and JavaScript operations that the code executes and sequence those and use that as the identifying like signature of the code. There's some cleverness in there that makes that particularly difficult to do in JavaScript versus other languages. But at a high level, it was saying let's identify things based on their behavior, not on their source.
And so would that be where the browser would have to load the script, see how it would affect the DOM, and then based on that, you would determine whether or not this was something that was probably showing you an ad or trying to track you, that sort of thing?
Yeah, so the way the project kind of worked toe to tip is there's these long lists of things that people previously have identified as being tracking related or ad related. Those are things like Easy List and Easy Privacy and the uBlock origin lists and all this kind of stuff. And so you can throw those at the web and you get some kind of nice label data set of these things are tracking and ad related, these things are benign. So you can run those, execute those files or load those pages and get signatures of how that code operates in the page. And so now you have like your ground truth signatures of this is what known bad code does and this is what known good code does. Then you can run that stuff against a bunch of things that haven't, like you don't know the labels of, and you can rebuild those labels on top of this code that people haven't examined before. And so you can do a couple things with that. You can either use that to build even more lists in an automated way. You can use it to do code rewriting, since you know some parts are good and some parts are bad. You can use it for online blocking, things like that.
You're basically looking at things that humans have identified as being bad behavior or tracking behavior, and you can load things that you haven't seen before and use that to almost generate, instead of having a human curate the list, you could have your code basically load things that it hasn't seen before and figure out like, oh, this looks like this thing that I've seen before that somebody said was bad, and so I'm going to make a new list based on that.
Yeah, exactly. So for the, Alexa 1000 or Alexa 10,000, like the most popular sites on the web, those have a lot of eyes on them. And so things that are tracking related get picked up, pretty fast on those. But for the long tail of the web, that stuff is rarely examined or at least, has a lot less eyes on it. And so this is a way that you can kind of use the code that people have looked at to identify code that fewer people have looked at.
I guess on a broad sense, like how deeply are people being tracked, and do you think people are aware of just how deeply they're being tracked?
So in the first case, like unimaginably so, like the amount of like web surveillance and offline surveillance that people undergo, like unimaginable. People who study it don't realize, a large amount. And in the second case, like almost very little. Like you'll find these tools that like Brave or the new version of Safari or AdBlock Plus or, any of these uBlock Origin, good tools by people who are like sincerely trying to reduce this stuff. And they'll point a little like, number in the URL bar and I'll say 10 trackers on this page or whatever. And you'll go to some news site and it'll have like 95 or whatever. Like, and that's just like the known bad stuff. I think people have very little understanding of how atrocious the situation is.
And what are some of the ways that people are being tracked by their browser?
Well, so I should say, like in most cases, the tracking isn't being done by the browser. Like that's not necessarily the case. Chrome absolutely does like observe things about what you're doing and send it to the Google mothership. But in general, the tracking isn't happening because of the browser itself, but rather by things the browser is loading because of things that web pages tell it to do. So, but so there's a whole long tail of like extremely boring, everybody understands kind of things that have been around for 20 years to like more weirdo stuff. And so by far, like still the most common method that people are tracked is just using, I drop a cookie on one site, I fetch the same image on another site, and so the cookie gets resent. And that's my way of learning the same person visited site A and site B. Web browsers like Safari and Brave will never send third-party cookies with a very small number of exceptions. Firefox and Edge have a kind of complicated system for determining when they send third-party cookies, but do a good job of not sending them to the worst offenders. Then things get slightly more sophisticated. So instead of like dropping cookies, maybe what you'll do is throw storage into other places where people don't usually look for it. So right now there's at least 4 or 5 different APIs, 6 different APIs you can use to have persistent storage on the browser through JavaScript. And then there's a whole long like tail of ways that things can get cached that also turn into persistent identifiers. That's like maybe the second weirdest or second most understood. Then there's a whole bunch of places where like the browser is implicitly keeping like global state that you wouldn't necessarily think about as being a tracking vector, but anytime you have global state, you have like the mechanism you need for tracking. And so kind of like the most frustrating example of these is something called HSTS tracking or HSTS cookies. Are you familiar with HSTS? It's an abbreviation for a header that a website can send you that says, always automatically upgrade this request to an encrypted version, to an HTTPS version, even if I request it over HTTP. So just in general, what would happen is I make a request to some website I like, and it's going to be HTTPS. HSTS instructions are not respected over HTTP generally. But I make a request to a website I like, it sends back this HSTS instruction that says, good, now that we have a secure conversation, I want you to never, ever not communicate with me over a secure channel. So we got this one secure communication, we're going to use this as like the kernel of trust to build the rest of our communication over. And so that instructs me every time I visit the site again, automatically, the browser will just know, add an S to the HTTPS. And the same thing is true for any sub requests or in general until people started coming up with countermeasures. The same thing is true of any sub requests as well.
If I understand correctly, you make a request to a URL and it tells your browser in the future, you try to go to this URL and you don't put in HTTPS to automatically go to HTTPS instead. And the part that I don't quite follow is how is that used to uniquely identify you?
Okay. Step one is I make a request to your website. It's a secure connection. Then on your website, say you have 26 different images, an A, a B, a C, a D, a E. And so my browser will make new requests for each of those images. And those images in this configuration are each hosted on different subdomains on your website. A images off a.u.com, that kind of thing. So now, if those are all requested over a secure channel, your server can decide, I'm going to send the HSTS instruction or not for each request. So I'll get back those images and I'll have more or less 13 new HSTS instructions. And those will be different for me than they will be for you, for anybody else, just, flipping a coin enough times. That's like the setting the identifier step. And then now, a week later or whatever, you want to identify me again. I clear my cookies and everything, so I think I'm not identifiable. But I come back to your site, and now you have me request the same 26 images, but over HTTP, not a secure channel. And now my browser will upgrade more or less 13 of those images. Your server will look to see which 13 images got upgraded. And now that'll be unique to me versus everybody else in the world.
I see. Wow. So it's a feature that had good intent, but the way that people are actually using it is they're building like a fingerprint, right? They know for each URL which one they told you to be able to upgrade to HTTPS and which one's not. And like you said, so even if you clear your cookies or whatever, the URLs that should be upgraded based on HSTS, they're still stored in your browser.
Yep. And so there's a long tail of these kinds of things where they were added to the web platform or to browsers or to the internet infrastructure for largely or completely benign or really desirable reasons. But because of the way they've been implemented or because of the way clever people have misused them, they become tracking vectors. HSTS is not at all the only one. It's just the one that is kind of the most galling because it's supposed to be, helping people's security and ends up hurting their privacy or can hurt their privacy.
Right. So in the past, you were talking about classic tracking that was making use of cookies, and that's something that gets stored in the user's browser. And my understanding is that for cookies in the past, you would go to a site, and in order to track somebody, while you're on that site, you're making a request to another domain, right? Like to a tracking domain. And as you go from site to site, those other sites use a cookie from that same tracking domain. So that's what you consider a third-party cookie. Is that correct?
Yeah. So I go to your site. Your site is, benign.com. Your site includes an image from tracker.com. I get the request back from tracker.com. It tells me to save a cookie from tracker.com. I go to some new website. It also requests tracker.com, and now tracker.com can link those views.
And so now that you were saying a lot of browsers like Brave and Safari and Firefox are starting to block third-party cookies, what are some of the ways that sites are working around that?
So there's a long tail. So some people have been moving to these kinds of more esoteric kind of tracking things. So HSTS tracking is one kind of thing that people in the wild were doing, particularly against Safari when Safari started blocking third-party cookies. Been moving to different types of identifiers in the browser. So maybe I don't store something in a third-party cookie, but I set a cookie on the first-party cookie jar, and then I just append that to my request. So things like Google Analytics do that. It's called writing on the first-party cookie jar because even though the code is executed by, say, Google Analytics or any number of other tracking scripts, it's actually living in your cookie jar. The cookie jar is associated with your origin. So those are two, and then it just kind of gets more oddball from there. So there's browser fingerprinting, if you're familiar with this, which is ways of finding like things that are semi-identifying or semi-unique in your browser, and then if you build up enough of them, you very quickly can identify a large number of people uniquely. It's like Guess Who, and you just split the population in half enough times. So that's done extremely commonly on the web. That's very, very common. And then there's a new kind of thing called bounce tracking. It's not that new, but increasingly common kind of thing called bounce tracking, where different browsers will only let you set third-party state if you visited them in the first-party context. And so websites will play these games where like they'll just forward you through a long number of first parties before you get to where you want to go. And now all these things can set third-party cookies on in iframes and things like that. I could go on and on. I mean, there's an endless number of ways these things are done, but getting rid of third-party cookies is definitely an extremely helpful thing, but it's not the end-all be-all of web privacy.
One of the things you mentioned was browser fingerprinting. What are some of the ways that people's browsers get fingerprinted?
Sure. At a high level, browser fingerprinting is looking for a bunch of things that are going to be different between people's browsers. They don't have to be unique to a single person, but they'll be minor configuration differences or subtleties that are different between my browser and your browser and somebody else's browser. For example, English is a very common language that's spoken on the web. And so if I know that someone's language, maybe that gives me, that identifies me 1 out of 20 people speak English on the web or something like that. Yeah, some number that's less than 1 or less than 100. That's going to also cut the search space down. And now I look, is this person, how many devices do they have plugged into their machine? That'll shrink it down further. What are the kind of peculiarities of their graphics card when I do different drawing operations? Does it do, draw a line in a slightly different way than on a different graphics card? That'll shrink it down further. Does the system have odd fonts installed? It'll shrink it down further, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And if you have enough of these kinds of things, you can pretty quickly put a lot of people in a bucket of size 1.
And one of the things you mentioned is that you can identify what devices are plugged into your computer and maybe what your graphics card is. What are some things you think people would find surprising about how much your browser is actually sending to the server that you're visiting?
So it depends on the browser that you're using, but that's a good question. I expect people would be surprised that any web page that you don't trust, so this is without a permission, websites can, in some browsers, enumerate all the devices you have installed, like the labels, the type, this kind of thing. They can learn about what kind of network connection you're on, whether you're plugged in. If you're in Chrome, the most popular browser, you can learn about the kinds of network errors the person is observing, which can be very identifying if you're moving between networks and they have different kind of DNS configurations. If somebody has a 2-factor authentication device, like a hardware key, you can learn some things about the hardware key, like the strength of it, even if you wouldn't expect a website can access that automatically. Those are just things like the browser is intending for websites to be able to access. That's not like cleverness. That's just like there is an API that will tell me specifically this. And then there's a long list of other things with a moderate amount of cleverness you can figure out as well.
I think a lot of people are familiar with the fact that when they go to websites, it'll ask for permission to use a microphone or to use GPS, things like that. For some of these other things that you're referring to that it's able to figure out, such as your devices that are connected, things like that, is that something where the person is giving permission, or is that something that just happens?
Yeah, so that just happens. That's something that, so I represent Brave on the W3C, and I co-chair one of the privacy groups on the W3C, the horizontal review group that reviews specs for privacy. And that's something that we're working with the working group that authors that spec, the median streams capture group, to improve that API. But that is just the way the API works in the standard right now. The website says, tell me about the devices the machine supports. It gets back a list of every device that the machine knows about that has like an AV component. And then then the website now says, okay, I would like to access this one. And then you get the permission dialog. But without any permission, you can learn all the devices and all the labels and the categories and this sort of thing. I should say that the spec looks like it's getting much better. That working group has been really good to work with and has been really receptive to those concerns. But that's the way it ships right now in Chrome, Edge. Brave makes some modifications to it. I don't know about the other ones, but that's the way the standard is written.
And that's a little interesting because you're saying that the standard is currently being written, but a lot of these different browsers, they already have an implementation of it.
Yeah, so this is another one of those like good intentions that have turned out to have unintended consequences kind of situations. So it used to be the case that if you're running a web standard, a bunch of people would get together and work on the standard, and then when it was done, people were supposed to implement it. And then this is a rough history. I'm sure I'm going to get some of the details wrong, but to a rough approximation, something like CSS2 happened where you ended up with a standard that was basically unimplementable. And it had all these kind of subtleties that hadn't actually been worked out because nobody had implemented it yet. There's other cases too, and CSS2 might not have been like the tipping point, but it was definitely like a famous example. Then there was a CSS 2.1 standard that came out when people started implementing it, and it had to get revised in certain ways to make it actually work in the world. Hand waving, simplification, but people thought, this is not great. We need to like actually build these things as we're talking about them to make sure that they work in the world. And so then you got into this kind of like prefix situation where I don't know if you're a web developer, you'll be familiar with like until pretty recently, like you had like all these like prefixed extensions where you're like rounded corners, but like WebKit rounded corners and Microsoft rounded corners and Mozilla rounded. Yeah, and you had similar things in the DOM, and there's still some hangover where like a bunch of specs in most browsers are implemented twice, once WebKit prefix, things like that. And so understandably, people thought this is not great. Now I have to write my code 4 different times. And so right now, if you're trying to get a standard finished in the W3C, I'm less familiar with other standards organizations, but in the W3C, you need to have 2 working implementations, like 2 independent implementations. They don't necessarily need to be shipping like unflagged, like the way it's supposed to work in the best cases, like they're running in the browser and there's some flag that you flip or it's only enabled for some set of websites, but that's not always the case. Things are getting shipped as they're being designed in the standards body. It absolutely is like a little bit begging the question, right? In that if you find out there's a problem during review that with the spec, well, now a whole bunch of websites have already started depending on that certain functionality and have it baked in. That is a real pickle and something that we fight with like a lot during these reviews. But yeah, that's the less than ideal situation that things have come to at this point. I think it's getting better, but that's generally how things are done right now.
So yeah, that's kind of interesting because it sounds like you have the W3C and you're planning on things that will go into the browser, but in order for them to become a standard, they need to already be in the browser, which also means, like you said, that people are already using them. I wonder what is sort of the negotiation or the back and forth in terms of, let's say Chrome is already using a certain feature and you say like, no, we'd like you to change this feature for this reason. They'll say like, well, we already have thousands of sites that are using this. How are we going to change this, right? So what does that back and forth look like?
Yeah, so the first thing to keep in mind is that like the standards body is not a legal organization, right? The standards body can't make anybody do anything. They can say something's not a standard, they can remove it, but people listen to a standards body if they want to listen to a standards body, and they don't if they don't. So in that sense, like a standards body works by trying to make it mutually beneficial for people to go along with it and providing resources that maybe that an organization wouldn't have if they weren't in the standards body, and some benefit in terms of interoperability, that sort of thing, to strengthen the platform in general. So that being said, there's not an easy answer. So sometimes you can find like kind of clever games you can play with the way the existing APIs work that will reduce the amount of information exposed, but without like breaking the function signatures or the kind of expected flow of the program. There's several different tiers of review in the W3C, happened earlier than others, and what we've been trying to do is push review earlier in the process to try to catch these things while they're still like in prototype stage instead of web scale stage. But yeah, there's nothing there's no way that the standards body can like go to Mr. and Mrs. Google and say you must do a thing, or Mr. and Mrs. Apple or whatever else. Unfortunately, sometimes fortunately, sometimes unfortunately, that's just the case.
And you were saying how you're the co-chair of the privacy interest group on the W3C. How much power would you say that group has? Do you have examples of times where somebody has tried to push a feature through and you've rejected it on the basis of privacy and there's actually been changes made or the feature's been dropped altogether?
I should say, in terms of power, like we're a subset of the W3C, and the W3C, like at the end of the day, the organization has maybe some moral authority or some, people respect it. And so there's some, soft, in quotation marks, power there. And there's a lot of expertise that people respect in the W3C. And there's a lot of mutual interest between the browser vendors to have a web that is friendly for developers and friendly for users. So there's no like authority, but there is, web browsers are interested sometimes in what the W3C does because of these other reasons. So power is a funny word to use there, though. I take your point. To point at like very specific changes that have been made, I'll talk about the WebRTC one, the enumerate devices API, because that's the one we just mentioned before. So right now, partially because of interest among people in the working group, partially because of reviews that Ping has done. Ping is the privacy interest group. There's both immediate changes that look like they're going to go into the API. None of this is 100%. This is all in the GitHub issues right now, but this is the direction it looks like things are going to go in. best guess. That there'll be a number of ways of like kind of shrinking the amount of information that websites can access by default. So that's things like without a permission, maybe you don't see this person has 18 different microphones. They just see there's at least one microphone, and then when the website asks for permission, then they can learn about the number, the details, things like that. So that's a wonderful thing. I think the working group would agree that's not like the dream outcome, but it's dramatically better than what was there earlier. And then we're also working with the working group. They're doing great work in terms of figuring out like where can we go to that's even better. And so that looks like it'll be like the website doesn't see anything by default. If the website wants to see devices, they call a thing. The browser prompts you with a list of devices, and then if you want to, that information gets passed. That's an example that comes to my mind. I mean, there's a long list. If it's of interest to your listeners too, I could also point you to like the endless list of privacy issues that we raise and the back and forth that happens on them there. But sometimes they're very large things like that. Sometimes they're very small things like you're leaking fingerprinting bits here, and let's figure out a way to sort through that.
One of the things I find interesting about your position is you work for Brave, which is a browser vendor, and you have Microsoft with Edge, you've got Google with Chrome, Apple with Safari, and Mozilla with Firefox. And I would imagine that all of these different companies, they all have their own goals, they all have their own things that they want. And I wonder from your perspective, what are the kinds of roles that each of these companies play, and where do they kind of butt heads, and where are they kind of on the same page?
I want to say things that I'm only, very confident about. All these organizations, and particularly the people that are sitting in these like committees, in these working groups that represent these organizations, have an interest in the web. They see there's something, unique about the web that is appealing and desirable and positive that's not on other platforms. They may not 100% agree on what those positive things are, but there's something that appeals to us about the web that doesn't exist on other platforms. And so there's mutual interest there. I also think that like all these people care about privacy. They care about making sure things are accessible to people with different needs on the web. They care about making sure APIs, work well for people who speak different languages and come from different backgrounds and these sorts of things. Like at the end of the day, people who like choose to spend their time in these long meetings working with each other, like, we have very similar interests and we're all pushing the same way. Where they differ is that prioritization of those interests. Like Brave is absolutely like, we think there's something super duper wrong, like kind of fundamentally wrong. Yeah, maybe that's too strong. But like the web has really gone sideways and the privacy violations are endemic and really horrible and like intolerable. I think other people would say, yes, privacy violations are bad, but it's also like, we also want to make sure that we like don't break the ecosystem that exists to fund the web as it exists today. And so that's like privacy is just one among many different interests, including making sure like advertising dollars still fund websites and things like that. And then I think there's other people who exist in other parts of on that spectrum and have different interests. So I think we're all kind of pushing the web in the same direction and are interested in making sure it flourishes. But what flourishing means probably differs between different people in different organizations.
Something that sometimes comes up, and it maybe is a little more front of mind because Apple's Worldwide Developer Conference happened recently, is that people have a perception of Safari not implementing a lot of features that other browser vendors either implement or want to implement. And I think a lot of times they say that they're doing it in the name of privacy. And on the other hand, you have developers who are saying, oh, we want all of these different features because we want to be able to build progressive web applications. We want to be able to build websites that are similar to apps. And I wonder, like, from your perspective, how do you balance these two goals?
So I think that's like a really interesting example that you brought up for a couple of reasons. One is I remember that I bet we're thinking about the same tweet that kind of went around and the same kind of people blowing off steam. And I can totally understand their frustrations. But I should say two things first before going into the guts of your question. One is that most of those things are not standards, they're proposals. And so as much as the web community may like to treat them as standards because they're implemented in a popular browser, they are not standards. Nobody has agreed to them, blah, 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 blah. They are proposals. The second thing is that I think there was like 16 or 17 or 18 different things on that list. I don't remember the full thing, but I remember looking through it and thinking like Brave takes the additional step of removing these things from Chromium before we ship Brave. Like I am completely sympathetic to the idea, and the vast majority of those cases, maybe all those cases, I just don't remember the full list, that those are really privacy risking features. And it's the permissions models around them are not well defined. They haven't been well reviewed. And like the risk is really significant. Like Apple's got, you know, more money than anybody knows what to do with. If Apple's not implementing it because they're lazy, like they may be pursuing a different strategy. But I also know that the people in those committees like have sincere, strong, heartfelt interest in privacy. So I understand the frustration in the web community, but I find the privacy story there compelling.
Mm-hmm. And I think it's also maybe important to think about the fact that as soon as you put those into the browsers, it's going to be extremely difficult to remove them, right?
Yeah, I mean, the web has this like, you know, it congeals around any features that gets there. And the moment you put something in, it becomes extremely difficult to pull it out. Yeah, it's something that we deal with at Brave a lot because we think that the way a lot of APIs work is, you know, inappropriate and intolerable. And we have to be very clever in the kinds of ways we can kind of modify behavior that websites already expect to exist in a certain way.
I think I know about the tweet you're referring to, and I don't remember all the specific features, but I wonder from your perspective, are these features that you think shouldn't exist, or is it more that the way that people want to implement them now wouldn't be done in a privacy conscious way?
That's a good question. So I also don't remember the full list, but I can pull off some examples. I think there's like kind of 3 tiers. Some things just seem like bad ideas that we should just not do, or at least not do without like pretty fundamentally rethinking how they exist. Some of these things are things because they make more sense as like operating system features or like native app features than they do websites. And some of these things are things like that. Maybe those would actually be very useful on the web if we could figure out how to do them responsibly. A lot of this stuff has its roots in not in things that like typical websites need to do, but like the union of a bunch of weird things that kind of happen. One is like Firefox OS happened for a while, and so a bunch of things got pushed into the web platform that some of which got yanked out later. Chrome OS is another one. PWAs, things like this. And a lot of these things are really different from what we think about as websites. It's worth thinking about like where are those lines and should they be firm or that sort of thing. A while ago, the example that sticks out of my head is there was a standard that got shipped in Gecko, in Firefox, in Chrome that allowed websites to read like the amount of ambient light in the room. The website could read, you know, is it very bright, is it very low? I don't remember the granularity, but you know, any step in between. And of course, like the very first place this stuff got used is in tracking scripts to fingerprint people. Same with the battery API. There was an API that allowed websites to say so full battery, low battery, that sort of thing. You can imagine why like that would be a nice feature in an app. You can also imagine it gets sucked into the fingerprinting scripts immediately and starts harming and targeting people. And so, yeah, there's definitely a part of the web that says, let's just permission prompt everything or use like the web as it is without adding more functionality has so many like deep privacy issues. It makes I feel very nervous about pushing for new functionality unless like privacy is really treated as a first-class citizen in those standards.
Yeah, and it sounds like where we're at now, there's already so many different ways that you can be fingerprinted, and every time a new feature is added to the browser, it just gets more and more easy, I guess, to track someone.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. And there's also cases where adding a new feature like undoes a privacy protection somebody else has added in somewhere else. It's good to be very cautious before throwing new powerful features into the platform.
Another thing that you had mentioned when we first talked about doing this interview was you had said that Brave is based on Chromium, and you said that you had a somewhat semi-adversarial relationship with upstream Chromium. I wonder if you could elaborate on that.
Sure, that was kind of a silly and a goofball way to put it. I don't think that misstates things too strongly. The Chromium developers have been very receptive to like questions that we have, and we've tried to upstream stuff. We found it to be a positive experience. But there are things where like the vast majority of Chromium developers are Google employees, and so of course Chromium is shipped in a lot of ways with Chrome in mind. I don't think it's a malicious thing, but it is the case. And so there's a whole lot of stuff in the Chromium code base that assumes Google, which servers get talked to, and account information stuff, and safe browsing things, and an incredibly long list of stuff that like is just in the Chromium code base but assumes Google, including, and this is maybe what I had in mind when I said adversarial, poor choice of words. There's a couple features that Chrome ships that allow you to basically enable a feature only on certain origins, and they're called like field trials, this kind of thing. So if the Chromium folks want to test out a new feature, they can say only these 3 or 4 or 5 or whatever partner websites can use it. Sometimes that feature gets shipped. They'll ship a feature ungated, like not flagged, and then they'll use this feature to turn it off. So they'll ship some new experimental feature, and then they'll say, but we're not going to allow it on any sites. Like the field trial set is 0 or is empty. And so that's their way of making sure that sites don't get it. Well, if you're building a browser that wants to put firm lines between itself and Google data collection servers, you don't get that information. And so now all of a sudden, like the weirdo experimental feature is enabled globally in Chrome or in your version of Chromium. A long list of things like that. There are also other choices in the platform that make certain things that we would like to do difficult. I could go on those examples if it's of interest. I don't think that's adversarial. That was a silly choice of words. But it does mean that there's different interests being pursued in the code base that are, not always Brave. It's not always as privacy focused as Brave would like.
I'm not sure if you would have an answer to this, but when Brave was kind of deciding what rendering engine to use, whether that's Chromium's Blink or WebKit or something else, why did they make the decision to use Chromium as a base?
So this predates me at the company, so I can only think through some of these things. Yeah, I don't want to say something I'm not sure about. The early Brave folks considered a bunch of different engines, and that Brave started as an Electron app. So basically, when there was an extremely small number of developers at the company, it was in its extremely early days. It was just a thing that was done on top of stock Chromium. It allowed the company to iterate really quickly and try a bunch of new things and do some of the kinds of things that it knew it wanted to do that were easier to do at that level than trying to maintain a large patch set and this kind of stuff against Chromium. And there's probably some path dependency on that. We're no longer an Electron app, right? We're like a proper Chromium project. That's part of it. I don't know the particulars of why Electron was selected and not a Gecko option or not a WebKit option. I couldn't say exactly what tipped the scale one way versus the other.
Something you mentioned was that private mode or incognito might be something interesting to talk about. So could you elaborate on what you were thinking there?
Like the battle of what like private browsing mode is and incognito mode is and like what that is supposed to do is, I think nobody has a single story for what it actually is supposed to be. In some browsers, it basically means like your storage doesn't persist after you close the browser. And that's all it means. Like the browser operates exactly the same way, local storage operates the same way, et cetera, except you have a separate cookie jar and a separate set of state that goes away when you close all your private browsing windows. That was for a long time, like kind of like the textbook definition or like the whatever everyone agreed on. And then, but you can see over time, like in standards bodies and in just in implementations, I think there's been some recognition that users have a different understanding, or at least some users have a different expectation of what private means, and it can connotate something beyond just the state goes away. And so there's been kind of like a slow drip of new features, new privacy features into private browsing windows in major browsers. So Firefox by default, if you enable a private browsing window and you're in strict versus default mode for intelligent tracking protection, it does slightly different things. Chrome changes the operation of some APIs that allow you to query like your quota on storage to prevent like sites from detecting whether you're in private browsing mode, et cetera, things like this. But I think it's interesting because it seems like it's like a recognition that users want more privacy in a machine and are kind of desperate for whatever buttons are in front of them, even if what guarantees are being made by those buttons aren't totally clear.
Yeah, that's a good point, because when I think of private mode or incognito mode, I think of your first example where it just means that it's going to clear whatever was stored on the computer, like cookies or your history, things like that. And what you're saying is like now the opinions have shifted to where like maybe private mode should be blocking trackers, or maybe it should be, I think the example you gave was preventing sites from finding out certain things about your computer or your browser. But yeah, that's a perspective that I didn't realize people thought, but that makes a lot of sense.
And maybe this is a positive thing. It's become a little bit, I'm not sure that's true. My impression, I wouldn't go to war over it, is that it's a little bit of testing ground for people to say, like, we know less people use private browsing mode than we use like the typical mode, so we can be slightly more experimental in the kinds of features we test out in private browsing mode for privacy-related features. if that's the case, then it means more stuff gets turned on by default over the medium term. I think it's probably a good thing for the web.
One of the things that you had sort of touched on earlier was when you're trying to preserve privacy, when you have features that are blocking certain things that could be used to track you or block certain features in the browser, one of the side effects of that is that it can break websites. And what are some common examples of where that can happen, and how are you at Brave, but browser vendors in general, trying to work around that?
Sure. So like the most common or goofball way that can happen is, say you're using some ad blockers, you're pulling in some filter list and it says you should delete everything that says ad in the URL or whatever, right? /ad/ something like that. Some website for whatever reason has something that's not an ad in the URL or something like that. Right now you're blocking something you don't intend, and there might be a script like the page depends on for like its execution. And given that like the size of these filter lists, given that you could easily be considering hundreds of thousands, maybe even 200,000 rules if you're using a tool like Brave or uBlock Origin or something like that. The possibility for false positives is very high. So that's like the simplest cases can happen. But then it gets more complicated. So Brave by default blocks third-party storage by default. There's a very extremely small number of exceptions that we make to unbreak websites, but by default we just block all third-party storage. So if you're in an iframe, you don't get to store stuff. You don't get cookies if you're a third-party request, stuff like that. And the vast majority of cases that works just fine. Like people don't usually care about the stuff that's going on in iframes on a page, and when they do, it doesn't usually need to touch storage. But you can imagine some cases that'll break. Someone embeds a video and that video wants to, store its state or something like that. That requires some cleverness in dealing with it. And then just a third example, this happened a bunch when when COVID started becoming a popular concern, is that people wanted to look at maps and see where like COVID was spreading. And so these sites would usually use things like either rendering these maps via SVG or via canvas operations. And Brave by default did no longer, but at the time was blocking certain canvas operations and SVG operations because we knew they were being used by fingerprinters. In all three of those cases, you have privacy protections that end up breaking things that, at least in these cases, are not privacy protecting or privacy harming. Probably even more so than my job doing like privacy stuff at Brave is figuring out how to do that privacy stuff in a web compatible way, or how to break less websites so people can use Brave without having to drop shields and drop those protections. And so each of those different things kind of warrants a different response. So one has been to adopt a strategy that the uBlock Origin project takes. The uBlock Origin project is fantastic, and all credit to those folks. That project is really fantastic work. Instead of just yes I allow the resource or no I block it, they'll also sometimes say replace it with some different thing that like maintains the API signatures but actually nulls out the tracking behavior. And so that's been a really useful approach for unbreaking websites, if we can figure out what they expect, like the functions they expect to be in place, but replace them with less painful stuff. And I can talk about a research project if it's of interest over the summer, actually with the student, Michael Smith, the student who's visiting from UCSD, to leverage this if that's of interest afterwards.
Are you replacing something in the JavaScript code that's running, or are you replacing some browser API that is trying to get access to?
Sometimes both. So in the simplest cases, like Google Analytics provides some functions or like triggers some events on load. And if you block Google Analytics, it means some things will never load. And so instead of blocking Google Analytics, you see, here's a request for Google Analytics. Instead, I'm going to return this thing that does nothing but trigger a load event, but it actually doesn't touch network or anything like that. And so you're replacing the resource instead of requesting it. But you might also do things like, I see that like some code that does something nasty or is inline, so I don't get a chance to modify the request. I see it's inline, and so I want to somehow modify its behavior. And so sometimes this stuff gets really gross, but I'm going to say overwrite some structure that the page expects to be there. I'm going to throw a stack trace. I'm going to look up and see if I'm in the inline code. If I am, I'm going to take path A, and otherwise I'm going to take path B. All these kinds of gross things. The web is a messy place, and there's a whole bunch of kind of tricks like that have to get pulled. So we pull a bunch of that stuff from the uBlock Origin project. We generate some of it on our own. For fingerprinting stuff, and this is something that someplace that we've been able to pull from research that I'm really proud of us shipping, or I'm really glad about, is in the same sort of way that the uBlock Origin said, it shouldn't just be yes or no. We should have some middle road that allows us to be more clever. We've taken the same approach of fingerprinting protection. So instead of just saying, yes, it's allowed, or no, the API goes away, we now do something we call farbling, where we break the assumption that websites have that the features are going to operate in a fixed way across browsers by adding a little bit of noise to the API response. So if you're doing some canvas operations, we'll, with very low probability, modify a pixel here or there, or flip a bit in like flip the lowest bit in a color channel for a pixel, that kind of thing. So instead of just saying like blocking the API to protect people, we can instead have this like more web compatible way where we still allow the API to work, but we remove its identifiability by having it always do something different between sites, between sessions. Something that we're working on right now, and we actually are working with a student from North Carolina who's prototyping this for us over the summer. This is another research intern named Jordan Stock, who's doing great stuff. We're looking into a third option for for remote storage. So instead of a frame, either yes getting storage or no not getting storage, we want this middle option where we can say
In this episode
the
of
frame
Software
gets what
Sessions,
looks like
I'm
normal
talking
storage
to
for the
Pete
execution of the
Snyder
page,
about the
but by
many
time
ways
the top page
websites track
the top
us,
frame is
how
closed,
ad
then that storage
blockers
goes
like
away.
uBlock
A lot of
Origin
this stuff
work,
is just figuring out ways.
and the process of
the web
developing
compatibility game is figuring out a bunch of ways of like breaking the binary choice and figuring out ways of like sneaking more cleverness into the platform.
So when you're referring to a frame and the local storage going away, could you kind of elaborate what you mean by that?
Oh, sure. So on a website, like a typical website, you have one frame, which is just like, there's a document object and there's a bunch of like DOM structure that hangs off of that. But one of those things that's hanging off of it might be an iframe, which is itself like its own contained document structure, and that can be infinitely recursed, or can happen infinitely deep. And so this is usually referred to as like the first party and the third party, or the first, like the local frame and the remote frame. There's some overloading of terms because in some browsers, like remote frames are also remote processes, like in the way that an operating system understands processes. But typically a local frame is a frame that has the same ETLD +1, which means effective top level domain +1, which is like the level of domain that you can register if you go to, Hover or whatever. And so all the frames that have the same ETLD +1 as the top frame are local frames. Anything else is a remote frame or a third party frame. And so browsers will use this as some browsers will use this as a heuristic for saying local frames the user trusts, and so I'm going to allow it to store cookies and local storage and this kind of thing. Remote frames deserve less trust, and so I'm going to block storage, or I'm going to partition storage, or I'm going to do something possibly clever with storage. Not all browsers do that, but it's increasingly common.
I see. And I think you were explaining how you could have let's say an embedded iframe, and it could use browser local storage, but maybe as soon as you click to another page, then that local storage goes away. Is that kind of what you were?
Yeah, so that's the approach Brave is taking. This is interesting. So there's another privacy group in the W3C called the Privacy Community Group, which is kind of like the sibling group to the group I co-chair. So I co-chair the review group that reads everybody else's specs and tries to improve the privacy of what other organizations or what other working groups are working on. Privacy CG is where browser vendors go to introduce new features. And so Brave is involved in both, and there's a lot of overlap between the two.
Earlier, you were talking about how people could be fingerprinted, they could be identified by seeing how things render, whether that's on a canvas or SVG. And what you were saying, the way that you were dealing with it, which I found was kind of interesting, is it sounded like you were adding additional information. So your video card might render something a certain way, but then you would add, I guess, additional things that would make it render differently than the video card normally would. And that's how you would sort of remove that as an identifying factor. I wonder also, you were also mentioning about how you had a research project at UCSD, and I didn't quite catch what exactly that was.
Yeah, so in that order, the first one, the adding information parts, this approach came out of two research papers a while back. One is a paper called Privacator, led by my current boss, Ben Lifshitz, who's a professor at Imperial in London. And the second paper was a paper called FP Random, Fingerprint Random. Both of those things kind of introduced this technique or kind of played with it. Brave is the first one who's kind of productized it or included it in a popular shipping browser. But yeah, the approach is to break the assumption that there's something unique about this browser that I can identify across sites. And so we randomize some of these features, or we add extremely subtle amount of noise that'll confuse fingerprinters, but but look indistinguishable to users. We do it in a way that's random but deterministic under each first party, under each session. So you close the browser, you get a new fingerprint, and you go to a new site, you get a fingerprint. And so that prevents things from being linked. So it's been a nice way of taking academic research and figuring out a way to use it for a shipping privacy protection.
Cool. So that was something that in your role at Brave, or I guess Brave as a company, decided that this was something to look into from a research perspective. And then because the research went well, you're able to move that over to the product side.
Oh, well, I wish it was the case. I mean, so these are papers that pre-existed at Brave.
Oh, okay.
It was a situation where we knew we had a problem. Websites were breaking because of our fingerprinting protections. We didn't want to leave people less protected. And so research was one place we could start digging for a solution. And likewise, so you asked about the project at UCSD this summer. There's a student who's visiting named Michael Smith. He's a fantastic student and a fantastic hacker. And so his project is, I mentioned before about the way uBlock Origin does these resource replacements. And so as you might imagine, like these things are very difficult to generate. They take a lot of stepping through the debugger and manually figuring out how these large JavaScript blobs operate, and particularly what subset of the functionality you need to maintain to unbreak the page is extremely tedious and doesn't scale well. And so the approach that Michael and I are working on, Michael's doing the hard work, is to see if we can automatically generate these things through a combination of browser instrumentation, a system we call PageGraph, which allows you to deterministically offline see the interaction of different elements of a page. AST analysis. AST is the abstract syntax tree, or it's a parsing step in executing JavaScript or parsing any language. And then code rewriting to identify the parts that are privacy harming, rewrite just those parts, and then we can programmatically generate these privacy preserving resource replacements in a way that can be automated instead of requiring the kind of heroic amount of manual intervention they currently do.
So if I understand correctly, currently when you use something like uBlock Origin and you go to a website, and let's say that website loads a script that has privacy implications, has some issues with tracking, but the behavior is still needed for that website to work, uBlock Origin will actually replace parts of the JavaScript source code so that the site still works, but it blocks whatever kind of tracking behavior that it was going to have. Is that correct?
Yeah, it's not that it goes fetches the resource and then does some rewriting on the fly. It just preloads this is the privacy preserving version of the Google Analytics script, this kind of thing. Brave does the same thing, by the way. We had someone who was an intern last summer, Anton, who's now a full-time employee at Brave and is phenomenal. But yeah, Brave does the exact same thing out of the box. So we preload all the same resource replacements and are generating our own and do this in the same way.
And then in the research project that you're currently working